भारत की संसद में पीओके को लेकर एक सर्वसम्मत प्रस्ताव पारित है कि वह भारत का ही हिस्सा था, है और आगे भी हम मानते रहेंगे।
ये भी याद रखे वो भी चूड़ियां पहने हुए नहीं, याद रखिए। उनके पास भी एटम बम है, याद रखिएगा।
लेफ्ट वाले तो भारत के परमाणु हथियारों को ही खत्म करना चाहते हैं। ऐसा लगता है जैसे इंडी गठबंधन वालों ने भारत के खिलाफ ही किसी से सुपारी ले ली है।
Just because elections doesn't mean irresponsible statements.
Spoken about this change global scenario, hedging against Trump for Europe.
So nuclear factor is back in a big way in the contest between major powers.
So, in this week's Raja Mandala, in your column, you've looked at the nuclear debate. There's been some stray mentions of it now, more than once actually, in the election campaign in India. But how that there's a larger debate and a lot of change that's happened in the nuclear scenario globally. And you've looked at that in the piece today. The first thing I wanted to ask is that what is the danger or something to be, because even in the 2019 elections, because there was a lot of sort of nationalistic fervor, then there was this talk of we can blow Pakistan out of the water kind of thing. Then this time it's a little different. Mr. Manishankar Ayyar, among others, saying that Pakistan is also nuclear, we have to be careful, and then that became a whole episode. What do you think that maybe elections are, whether they're the right time to be having debates on something as complex as nuclear arsenals or even civilian nuclear?
No, I think, the world has lived with nuclear weapons and many democracies have lived with them. Just because elections doesn't mean irresponsible statements. And I think there's a danger you create a self-delusion for yourself. That is, for example, saying, Pakistan doesn't matter, its nuclear weapons don't matter. That's not true. I mean, objectively speaking, in fact, they've always had a more sophisticated nuclear weapons program than ours, because it's run by the Pakistan Army. They're very narrowly focused on India, and they've had strong Chinese support. So for them, this is really something for them that to protect themselves against Indian, interventions, whatever you will. And it's also an instrument they've used to use the nuclear cover to pursue cross-border terrorism against India, which limited your options to strike back using conventional weapons. So this was a problem that India has struggled to deal with ever since Pakistan acquired nuclear weapons. So I think our own experience suggests how hard it was. Even in the Pulwama incident, I mean, finally, you can't say India won. Yeah. That it was a draw. It was in a way, they were shootout, you hit them, they hit back, and India lost one aircraft. India claims it shot down an F-16. So I think it's not such a simple thing. So therefore, I think while Mr. Manishankar Ayyar might have given them an opportunity, I think as a ruling party that's responsible for security, I think you would have probably expected the government to be a little more restrained. But I think my sense is, wink and nod, I suppose you tell your other interlocutors, look, this is all election, so it doesn't really matter. But I think it kind of, for the public at large, I mean, you start believing this, that we have no problem with Pakistan nuclear weapons. Yeah. And then we're not paying attention to the rest of the world, because we always say, look, we don't care for Pakistan. But then all that we've talked about is only Pakistan. Yeah. When it came to the nuclear issue, because if China is the bigger threat, but there was no debate on the Chinese nuclear weapons. As we said, the world is reporting China is dramatically expanding its nuclear arsenal, and you have had a border situation for 4 years. So how do we deal with it? I mean, these issues, of course, have not figured in the manifesto, and even less chance of it being in the public discourse during the campaign.
Right. Just to take this forward, which you just said, in the article, everyone should read it. It will have a lot more detail and insight, and different insight and detail as well. So it should be on the indianexpress.com, and wherever you're watching this video, in the description, you should find a link to the piece. So, this, apart from just our neighborhood, but now it's, especially when it comes to, when you talk about nuclear weapons, you've spoken about this change global scenario. hedging against Trump for Europe? Could you expand on that a little bit just for our listeners?
Look, I think many of us had assumed that with the end of the Cold War, I mean, the major powers, the nuclear issue was no longer a factor. All the talk was about proliferation, Pakistan getting nuclear weapons, India getting nuclear weapons, Iran getting nuclear weapons, North Korea has got nuclear weapons. But it was assumed that nuclear weapons were not a problem between America, Russia, and China. What we've seen happen in the last few years is really nuclear weapons are part of the big story of the conflict between US and Russia, Western Russia in Europe. Russia has been rattling the nuclear threat quite often. In fact, even last week, there were nuclear exercises. Essentially, Russia is telling the West, look, don't cross too many lines. We've got nuclear weapons, you better watch out. So I think this is the first time even we didn't see this kind of thing even in the Cold War. But today we see when Russia and the West are fighting, nuclear weapons have become important. In Asia too, a China that is assertive, armed with nuclear weapons, is pushing its neighbors. And if anyone tries to push back, then they say, look, we got the nuclear weapons. And that's one reason why China is expanding its nuclear arsenal. And the US is trying to balance China and Asia. So China is saying, look, they're going to expand the nuclear arsenal and make it much harder for the US. And this is leading to a situation where Japan and Korea, which have relied on American nuclear umbrella, now do they make their own nuclear weapons? Or do they depend on the American arsenal? Because if Trump comes, Trump is saying, look, I'm not interested in this stuff.
Yeah.
Then I think the question of whether Korea will make nuclear weapons, whether Japan will make nuclear weapons, these are very abstract theoretical debates, but I think they've acquired a new life just in the last 1 year. So nuclear factor is back in a big way in the contest between major powers.
Finally, again, everyone should read the piece. It has a lot more in it. There's also civilian nuclear energy that you talk about. Even in India, we've sort of that conversation seems to have almost fallen off after the India-US deal and then the power plant, and I think it was Tamil Nadu that under the Manmohan Singh government. We don't really hear about nuclear energy as much. Whereas it is coming back in a big way. It still happens to be one of the cleanest and actually safest. I mean, that's my opinion. Don't hold anyone to it, but there is forms of energy. How do you think, given the pressures of climate change now, and increasingly that becoming part of how you can do business globally in your own energy needs, what are the 4 or 5 things you think, the 3 or 4 things the next government needs to do to facilitate or at least start talking about that option more seriously?
You remember 2005 to 8, there was such a big fight on the nuclear deal with the United States. Manmohan Singh government had to get a confidence vote in the parliament. The CPM and the left parties walked out of the government coalition. So it barely survived by the skin of its teeth. Yeah. But the fact is, since 2008 is almost 16 years. Yeah. We haven't bought a single new reactor from the West. So the original reactor was actually from the Americans in Tarapur. So in 16 years of past, we thought the nuclear deal was going to change India, dramatic, India's foreign policy will collapse, but nothing has happened. Only a couple of reactors, I think we bought from Russia. A couple others are under construction again from Russia. So in a way, what's complicated is that the Liability Act that we passed actually has made it very difficult for anyone to invest in India's nuclear program, including for Indian private companies. So therefore, if doing all this, we shot ourselves in the foot with a liability law that actually makes it very hard for the private sector or anybody to actually invest in India's nuclear program. And the government doesn't have the kind of resources to keep funding the DAE. Look, we'll give you money, you build reactors. That too is not sustainable. So for just when the demand for nuclear energy is growing, both for the climate reasons, as well as for the AI and the new digital technologies need a lot more power. So India has now really fallen behind countries like China, Japan, of course, and Korea. As we mentioned in the article, India was the first Asian country to set up a nuclear power plant. Today, actually, we are really way behind. We're not only able to build a large program, it is the Koreans who built a large program. Koreans are also selling reactors all around the world. India should have had a nuclear industry, which should not only build for ourselves, but it could have been a major export thing. Therefore, I think the challenge for the new government is to, one, take a fresh look at the liability law. And second, also review the Atomic Energy Act, going back to the early years after independence. That framework is no longer sustainable. And I think it has to take a fresh look. What are the legal conditions under which nuclear energy is being pursued in India? How do we modernize the nuclear sector is an important task. And I think this barely figures in our debates. But I think if we want to be a major nuclear player, we have to build up a nuclear industry. And that in turn requires big changes in our nuclear legal framework, a regulatory framework, and the environment in which the private sector can invest in the nuclear power sector.
Right. So hopefully the next government will get started on that. Thank you so much, sir. We'll talk again next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Akash.